It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, former anti-corruption czar John Penrose, Shadow Policing Minister Sarah Jones, Chief Executive of the Left of Centre think tank, the New Economics Foundation, Miata Fahnbulleh, and former Brexit Party MEP and Conservative Minister Anne Widdecombe. Today, this could be your last chance to catch a train before strikes bring much of the rail network to a halt.
I think the campaign will intensify if we don't get a settlement. We've got a mandate that runs for 6 months.
What's the answer to this political blame game?
Not only are the government not lifting a finger, it's impossible to escape the conclusion that they are actually trying to provoke this dispute.
In what sort of crazy world would anybody want to see our transport sector come to a halt?
Will the government listen to this advice on the cost of living?
You may have had 3 budgets and that may seem enough, but you're going to have a 4th budget. It's absolutely essential.
Potholes are a big problem here. We'll hear about an unusual solution from South Africa. And is Nadine Dorries right about this?
I think we're back in the realms of Remain versus Leave, sadly.
Well, let's start the programme picking up on that point from the Culture Secretary, saying we're back in the world of Leave and Remain. We're certainly hearing a lot more about Brexit in recent weeks and months. The government want to talk about it much more. We hear Labour are planning to set out their post-Brexit vision on immigration at some point. So my opening question to the panel is, are we back to a world of Leave versus Remain, John?
I don't think so. I mean, I think Nadine is right to say that there are still echoes and ripples spreading along, so she's absolutely right to make that point. But I hope that it is a declining sort of a force in British politics. We're several years past the vote now, after all. But she is also right to say that there's a whole series of bills that are coming up which are designed to reset where we are in a post-Brexit world. So, for example, there's a better regulation bill just coming up, which is designed to get rid of red tape and those sorts of things. So there will be examples of it coming up, even though it isn't the force that perhaps it once was.
Do you agree with Nadine Dorries? Or are things being seen, Sarah, through the prism of Leave versus Remain?
I think maybe Nadine wants them to be, because that harks back to a time when the Prime Minister was a bit more popular. Now, of course, there are things we need to sort out. We need to make Brexit work. There's a lot of issues around red tape, around bureaucracy, about how we get the movement of goods. But that argument is settled. And however much Nadine might want us to stop talking about the issues of the day and her 12 years of government failure, those are the things that actually people really want to talk about now.
Anne, are we still in a world of Leavers and Remainers?
I don't think the operative word is still. I think for some time we weren't. And it's really only been over the last few weeks when questions about Boris's position were raised, and you had people like Tobias Ellwood saying, well, we could go back into the single market, blah, 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 that it started again. And I share John Penrose's hope that, we just put that behind us and we get on with the more serious and pressing issues of the day. As I say, a few weeks ago I would have said, oh, nonsense. But because of some of the pronouncements that have come out recently from Remainers, I'm less sceptical.
Anne mentioned Tobias Ellwood talking about rejoining the single market. Anna McMorrin, a shadow Labour minister, also talked about it if there were a Labour government. Are we back to a world of looking at everything through the prism of Leave and Remain?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think Nadine and some of her colleagues may want us to, because it's sort of in the hope that they can sort of rebuild the coalition that they put together in 2019. But I think the country's moved on. And I think that there are big questions about the fact the economy is failing. You know, the lowest growth rates in advanced economies were projected to have, the huge cost of living squeeze. And I think those issues drive drive a massive wedge through Brexit, and I think that's the thing on people's mind. But what I do think is important is, we were promised the government said, give us the freedoms, more sovereignty, and we will use that in order to solve the big problems that you have. And I think for a lot of people who are looking at their living standards being absolutely hammered, they will be asking, where is the innovation? How are you using your newfound powers that you claimed you were going to get in order to make our lives better? That is the issue of the day. And I don't think the settlement that we have solves that. And the fact that we're still dealing with Northern Ireland and everything else suggests that we haven't got Brexit to work. And that is an issue the government has to grip.
Anne, were you nodding along with some of what Miata was saying there?
I was nodding along with some of it because I also say regularly, look, we left, we have got these freedoms, we can control our own VAT, for example. We could do so much, and yet we don't. Now, I'm sure that Miata and I are coming from it from slightly different angles, but it's a frustration to me that having fought all those years for those freedoms, we're not using them as well as we should be.
All right, well, what will come as frustration for many people are rail strikes that will commence tomorrow. There'll be widespread travel disruption as railway workers hold strikes over pay and jobs this week. The action will affect train lines across England, Scotland and Wales. You can look here at the timings over the next 3 days and the services that are going to be affected. If you look at this map here, it shows the lines that are running across the country, but you can see vast swathes of the UK will be without rail services across those 3 days. Now, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has accused ministers of failing to engage with unions and wanting the country to grind to a halt so they can feed off the division. And the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, you saw in the headlines there, has written to Keir Starmer calling on him to personally condemn the strikes. And is this blame game helping us get closer to a resolution?
Well, I think we're not particularly close to a resolution, but I think there's an awful lot of silly rhetoric. For anybody to suggest that any government, let alone one under the pressures that this one is under, wants to damage the economy at a time when we've got rampant inflation and huge problems, is just in cloud cuckoo land. And I don't think that the Labour people who are saying that even really believe it. But where I think Grant Shapps is right is to challenge Keir Starmer because he has resolutely refused to condemn strikes, which are going to cause massive disruption, damage the economy, and probably also cause a lot of suffering. Some people can only get to hospital appointments on public transport.
All right, well, let's put that to Sarah. Is it complete nonsense having Labour ministers say that the government would actually like these strikes to go ahead? And will Keir Starmer personally condemn them?
So what's nonsense is the idea that the government can't help resolve this issue. Nobody wants the strikes. Keir Starmer doesn't want the strikes. No. I don't want the strikes. Nobody wants the strikes. The question is, what do we do to try and avert them? Now, the government has refused to get involved in the negotiation. That is wrong. They could have real clout. When we had problems with Liberty Steel, did Kwasi Kwarteng say, no, I'm not going to meet the trade unions? Of course he didn't. He got in the mix and did what he needed to do. Now, Network Rail is a public company. It's owned by the government, by the taxpayer, so much so that the government are winding it up next year and turning it into something else. So they have complete control over Network Rail, and the rail operating companies have not been given any mandate from the government. They need that power from the government to negotiate. So unless the government gets involved, Grant Shapps should spend less time writing letters to Keir Starmer and more time trying to fix the problem so that we all don't have the disruption that we might see coming otherwise.
Is Sarah right, John? The government can't wash its hands of this. It can't say it doesn't have any involvement.
Well, I think that it's ridiculous to say that the government is looking forward to this with any kind of licking its lips or anything like that.
But they could get involved.
But I agree with you that there is a limited role for government, but not a big one for an awful lot of this stuff, because an awful lot of it is with train operating companies. But I think it's just really, really weird to think that people are looking forward to this with any degree of relish on either side. It's just silly.
Right. Well, what about a resolution? Why isn't the government getting involved?
No, the government needs to be really careful, because what's happening here is that people are trying to drag government ministers into the middle of this negotiation because of all this political blame game that's going on, which is what you've just described right at the top of this. And the unions would love nothing more than to have the government right in the middle of it. And the government shouldn't be in the middle of it, but they should be playing a role around the edges if they can possibly help. But if they get dragged into the middle, that just politicises it. It makes the megaphone diplomacy that we're seeing at the moment even worse.
But it is politicised because the government have said
it is.
to Network Rail and to the rail operating companies, I mean politicised in its broadest sense, the government have said to Network Rail and the rail operating companies, you need to cut by 10%. So we have seen already thousands and thousands of cuts to services, but we're now looking at some issues which may interrupt the security, the safety of the passengers and the staff who are on those trains. So, of course, the government has a role to play. They can't say, make 10% cuts. We're not going to give you a negotiating mandate, but there's nothing we can do, because that's simply wrong. Of course, they can follow do what Kwasi did. Get involved, come to a resolution.
But the taxpayer has stumped up billions, absolutely billions, during the course of the pandemic to keep the railways going. I think it's perfectly reasonable that the taxpayer then is allowed to say, look, normally we don't have to subsidise the railways to anything like this amount, and that's not a sustainable long-term answer. That's a perfectly reasonable thing for taxpayers to be saying.
Why are the Welsh government able to do it?
Across the world, governments are subsidising their public transport system. And, I do think the government's at the centre of this, because if you go to the root cause, £4 billion worth of cuts to our railways, £4 billion to our railways and Transport for London, that is the thing that has catalysed this, and this is the thing that has brought it to a head. And for me, that seems completely mad when actually, against the context of cost of living, when you look at Germany, they're putting more subsidies so that people can travel across public transport for €9 a month, and you've got net zero. So why we are cutting when we should be investing makes no sense. And if you come back to this, what are they striking about?
Right.
It's about safety. We are about to
pay.
Safety and pay. But let's take the question of safety. We're about to see 600,000 cuts to maintenance hours.
Well, let's have a look at pay, Miata, because I've been conscious, listening to many interviews about this, that no one talks about the figures involved in terms of what's being asked for by the unions, which would be an inflation-busting pay rise. It could go up to 10, 11% by the end of this year. That's a large number. I don't know what John thinks the number should be in terms of a pay rise, or at all, or what Sarah thinks it should be. What do you think it should be?
Well, so they are right to ask for, to compensate for cost of living, and then there's a negotiation.
A cost of living, OK.
And then there's always a negotiation. But, let's take the question of pay against the context where we have seen huge stagnation in wages.
I've seen you,
against the context in which we're seeing a huge hike in cost of living, it's not unreasonable for them to ask for increases in pay.
All right.
Well, for me, that is the thing that the government should be sitting around the table in order to try and come to a resolution, because at the end of it is a question of public investment and the decision by the government to cut.
And what's wrong with that?
What is wrong with that is that we're going back to the inflationary spiral, which those of us who lived through the 70s were very, very familiar with, whereby there is a rise in the cost of living, and therefore people want their wages to go up to, and I quote your contributor, compensate for it. That is the one thing we mustn't do. Whatever level the pay rise is at, it's got to be below inflation, No, let me get through this. Below the rises in cost of living, for this reason, that if they bust inflation or even get very close to that level, then what happens is prices go up in order to meet those wages. And because prices go up, there's then a demand for higher wages. That is the spiral that it is the government's duty to resist.
So there is no evidence that we're seeing a wage inflation spiral. We've seen that actually regular wages are down by 2.2% in real terms. That phenomenon is not playing out. And I think against the context where people are seeing huge squeezes, it is right. What I don't understand is that since the pandemic, train operators have taken about £500 million of profits from the taxpayer. Why is the government not saying we're going to cap your profits? Why are they asking the workers to bear the brunt of this? There is always a choice there. And my view is that against the context where people are feeling a massive squeeze, we shouldn't be asking workers to take the hit.
Anne?
Everybody has got to be asked to take a hit, not the hit. But what I do dispute very strongly was your opening sentence, where you said, well, there's no evidence of the spiral yet. No, this is the beginning. And if the rail workers are successful in getting an inflation-busting pay rise, other unions will very naturally want the same thing. And it is to prevent that spiral that I'm saying it's the government's duty to resist inflation-busting pay rises, to prevent that spiral.
All right. Well, Sarah, where would you put the pay rise at?
Well, firstly, this kind of tone of, the government has a duty to do X, Y and Z. Of course, the government has duty to do lots of things, but this government has just wasted £11 billion on COVID fraud.
But hang on.
They've wasted billions on PPE that's literally been burnt. I mean, they are not being careful with public money.
All right, so
as
do
an
you
aside.
think they should get 11% if that's where inflation is going?
Each of our sectors have different ways of negotiating pay increases.
So the
RMT are absolutely right to ask for a reasonable pay rise, and there needs to be.
But what is that, Sarah?
I do not have a figure.
Negotiating, what would you put it at? If they've been offered 3% and 11% is the level of inflation by the end of the year, be honest, and I'm going to do the same with John, where should the pay rise be?
I do not have a figure. Right. What I would say is that because this rail negotiation is about safety, it's about lines, it's about money, it's about wages, it's about a lot of things. But they are right, as Miata said, they're absolutely reasonable to ask for a pay rise. Now, the point is the government should have seen this coming. We knew a year ago, 2 years ago, well, for 12 years we've had wage stagnation, but we knew that these problems were coming. We said have emergency budgets to tackle the cost of living crisis, do things to help people now with the bills that they face, get the economy moving in the long run, sort out our energy crisis so we're making our own energy and using our own supplies, and make sure we've got a proper economy that's fit for the future so that we can move much faster and get the economy growing, and so people will automatically then, these issues of inflation go down and people can have decent pay.
Well, that's what Sarah says Labour would do and thinks the government should do the same. What figure would you give the RMT?
Well, my point is that I don't think ministers should be dragged into the middle of this. I don't think the government should have a
So you won't have a resolution? No, so you're just going to leave it and we could have more strikes?
No, you can have a resolution. I think it's absolutely right that everybody should strain every sinew.
But I don't have a resolution because the government haven't given them a mandate.
The unions want this desperately to be a direct negotiation in a sort of 1970s awful style between unions and government ministers.
I understand that.
That's a trap we must not fall into.
Do you think the RMT and do you think railway workers deserve a pay rise that's above 3%?
I think that everybody deserves and needs a pay rise given what's going on with inflation. But I think that if you start to say the government must nominate a figure, that you achieve what the rail unions want, which is to drag ministers into the middle of what should be a commercial conversation.
Right, let's move on, because over the past few months there have been many critics and opponents of Boris Johnson who have said that the government has been doing things policy-wise to distract from the Prime Minister's problems and also made announcements to shore up support for him. Tory MPs, in fact, were the latest to complain in the Northern Research Group after Boris Johnson, as they say, pulled out of a speech he was supposed to be given on Friday in Doncaster and went to Kyiv in Ukraine instead. In response, Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, tweeted this: helping Ukraine win and trying to help at home are linked. Part of the inflation we see comes from gas and food prices, which are partly driven upwards because of this conflict. Amazing how an important trip can generate so much conspiracy, and you can fill in the blank there. But rubbish, anyway. I'll suggest that one just for now. So can I suggest you the trip to Kiev, the introduction of imperial measurements, the Rwanda policy in terms of asylum seekers, the introduction of grammar schools being talked about. Can they all be distraction? Or are these legitimate policies, Sarah?
So I think we have seen a series of dead cat announcements that are designed to support and bolster Boris Johnson and to distract us all from 12 years of Conservative failure. That is true.
Including
on Ukraine, we absolutely support the government's actions in Ukraine. And of course, Ben Wallace is right to link all of these issues together. The issue with Ukraine that I find peculiar is the idea that someone other than Boris Johnson in the Conservative Party wouldn't have exactly the same policy. If Jeremy Hunt was Prime Minister, if Keir Starmer was Prime Minister, I suspect we would be following exactly the same lines. So on that front, it isn't. It is a slightly peculiar argument that some people seem to be putting forward, that he's the only person that would follow this policy when he patently isn't.
I mean, imperial measurements, introducing those, was that really a serious policy that had been on the government's mind for so long that this was the time to introduce it?
If it was, it wasn't something that anybody had spoken to me very much about. No, I mean, look, that's an example of something where a bit of extra flexibility, a bit of rule relaxation wouldn't hurt. But I do take your point that I think there's an issue here that because the Prime Minister has had to have a reset, because we had this vote of no confidence a little while ago, the danger is that everybody sees everything through that prism. And even when you have really sensible policies, things like what we're doing with Ukraine, the danger is that they get viewed through that prism and people lose sight. You get this sort of Westminster conspiracy mill sort of churning away, and people lose sight of the fact that actually, some of these things are being done for exactly the right reasons, all the way through because they're the right thing for this country or for peace in Europe, whatever it might be. And the danger is that therefore they get sort of devalued because of this sort of Westminster conspiracy mill thing.
The Prime Minister has devalued it all, hasn't he? I mean, it's his.
That really wasn't what I was saying. Really wasn't what I was saying.
Breaking of the rules, which as you know, is a real issue, and it does percolate through everything that we then talk about.
Well, is that what's happening, Anne? I mean, you were in politics an awfully long time. You know, governments do a mixture of shoring up support with policies that might appeal more to the party's base, as well as the sorts of things that John has just set out, legitimate policies that are good for the country, as he put it.
Well, as you rightly say, I was in politics for a long time, 23 years to be precise at Westminster, and I've seen this before, and it's called you can't win. If you don't introduce bold, eye-catching policies like Rwanda or grammar schools or whatever it is, then people like me, who are yelling the face down, saying, what do we have Brexit for? Get on with it. Get some really good policies going out there. You've got another 2 years. People like me will be saying that. Then if you do have the bold policies, then other people say, oh, well, it's only in order to shore up Boris. So it's a sort of no-win situation. And my question to the Tory party is, do you really want to win? Because if so, forget this sort of nonsense and get on with the policies.
So you still see him as an electoral asset in that sense, then, Boris Johnson?
I think he can be. I think he's been very damaged by what's happened, but I think he can recover. I think he can be. But the point is that the Conservative Party, has really got a choice. It either goes on for the next 2 years in endless squabbles and criticisms of Boris, whether overt or covert, or it gets together as a fighting force to win the next election. It's choice. It's choice.
John, maybe Anne's thinking of you as part of the
yes.
Conservative Party. Yes, there you are.
Just to be clear, so I think that's absolutely the right way to frame it. We have got to get on with the job of delivering. I mean, there's in the government's defence, we have had a pandemic for 2 years. There have been other things going on, but she's absolutely right to say now we're out of the pandemic. We've got the second half of the Parliament to go. We've got to put the foot on the accelerator. So you're 100% behind Boris Johnson. I can't pretend that because I was one of the 148 who voted the other way around.
And you've just resigned from your job.
Yeah, absolutely. But my point is that he has won himself, and people like me need to both accept and respect the result of the vote of no confidence. I've said so publicly before, I'll say it again today. We have to accept and respect that result. We have to give the Prime Minister a chance to do the reset that he said he wants to do, give him that space and give him the chance and support him if he will put his foot on the accelerator and get on with the kind of reforms where Anne and I think, would be in 100% agreement about the fact we've got to get on with this.
So we've had a Conservative government for 12 years. We've got 6 million people on the NHS waiting list. We've got 1 million people on the housing waiting list. We've got the highest tax we've had in 70 years. These are big issues. Chartering a plane that never takes off and costs millions of pounds is not the answer. Harking back to some, olden times by bringing back, policies of imperial measures and the like is not the answer. We have huge talent in this country, huge possibilities. We have our universities, our language, our people, all these things. The government could be gripping all the talents that we have and coming up with a policies that would push our country forward, not going back to weights and measures and trying to blame everybody else for the problems that they're of their own making.
Well, I mentioned, John, that you had obviously resigned from your role as anti-corruption czar. At the end of last week, the Prime Minister's ethics advisor, Lord Christopher Geit, also resigned, revealing his frustrations in his resignation letter. The Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries, was on LBC Radio last night answering a caller about this very issue. Let's have a listen.
Hi, Jo. Well, you call him Lord Guy. I think the rest of the country had never even heard his name before and used to call him Lord Gedit. And I don't think they give a fig who replaces him or even who he was or what he did. So I suppose the substance of your question is who should replace him? I don't know, actually, and I don't think it should be one individual because the whole, Lord Gedit, Geit, Lord Geit, sorry, I call him Lord Geit.
Geit.
Yeah. Actually, most people up north don't call him Lord Geit and don't know who he is. But he complained so often about the amount of work that he had to do that I don't think one person can probably do the job.
Maybe this government kept him busy.
Oh gosh, Sarah saying, what's your reaction listening to that, John? I mean, is that the way a Cabinet Secretary should be speaking about Lord Geidt?
Well, I think the important thing now is to make sure we get somebody who is going to be unafraid to speak truth to power in as his successor, and to make sure that they have the powers. They need a few extra powers in order to make sure that there is always, doesn't matter, current government, future government, we need to have somebody in that role who will run up the red flag if there is an ethics issue. And it's vital that therefore you can have three people doing it. I don't care, but you've got to have somebody occupying, or some group occupying, that central, essential position to make sure that every government in future, no matter which party is in power, flies straight.
Is she right that no one gives a fig about Lord Geidt and the fact he was there and resigned?
I would respectfully disagree with Nadine about that, because I think that you've only got to look at the polling, you've only got to look at the way that this has played out to see that there's been quite a lot of damage inflicted on the Prime Minister over this. That's why he's stood up and said he wants to have a reset. And therefore, I think it is wrong to say that you can just ignore it. It's not. It's real.
Do you think it should be one person, three people replacing Lord Geidt?
I don't know how many people, but I do think that when you lose not one but two of your ethics advisors, there's a real problem there. And I don't think you can brush it away. I don't think you should be blasé about it. I think it is about standards. And, for me, it matters because it's about trust in politics. And, we think about the issues on the table. They're massive. And we need people to trust that our government and our politicians are doing the right thing. And if you don't tell the truth, if you act below the standards, that has a problem. And going back to the kind of point about distraction, I think we have had a barrage of nonsense coming out of the government. The point Ad made about good policy, it is not good policy. I wouldn't mind if it was bold policy that I disagreed with, but it's half-baked nonsense that, for me, is there to distract. It is there to distract from the failings of the economy, a massive cost of living crisis, and a government that isn't getting a grip on that. So Boris's woes is about trust and about lies and about Partygate, but it's also about the central issue of the day, the government not having an answer on it, not having an answer to the cost of living crisis, not doing enough, and people are feeling it, and in the end, that will be his undoing.
Do people give a fig, Anne, about Lord Geidt and his resignation?
I don't think they care too much. They sort of, I think, absorb it subconsciously as though, this is just something else that's going wrong. But one might actually look at the cause of Lord Geidt's falling out with the Prime Minister, and it was over the Prime Minister wanting to protect British steel. Well, I see no reason why, particularly in our post-Brexit world, a Prime Minister should not want to protect British steel. And I think this is the sort of discussion we need to be having. As for who should take over, I think you need at least two people. You need one who's got a knowledge of Westminster, who understands practicalities, who doesn't take a purist interpretation of every last comma and dot. And you need somebody also from the outside who just brings a more purist attitude. And that is what you need. You need the balance. And I don't see it, and I don't know what the PM will do.
All right. Just to bring you this news, we've been told that the Prime Minister has had a minor routine operation relating to his sinuses. The operation was first thing this morning, back in Downing Street, around 10 o'clock. It was obviously in the early hours. And while we're talking, that came out of lobby when the political journalists asked the Number 10 spokesperson about all the various stories of the day. One of them was about this rather curious appearance of a report in Saturday's Times claiming that Boris Johnson tried to get Carrie Johnson, his now wife, the Chief of Staff job at the Foreign Office for £100,000 a year when he was Foreign Secretary. It appeared, and then the story disappeared, which seems to have attracted even more attention, understandably. They were asked about it at the Number 10 briefing. Spokesperson said, "We don't comment on issues referencing Boris Johnson's career before he became Prime Minister, but point you in the direction of denials from Carrie Johnson's spokespeople about the story." Does that satisfy you, John?
Well, I've no idea if the story is right or wrong. As you said, it apparently appeared for a brief period in the. Was it in the Times?
It was in the Saturday Times, yes, and then deleted.
And then the Guardian got excited about it. So I've no idea if it is true or not. What I would say is that this sort of stuff would have absolutely no airtime. We wouldn't be talking about it on a programme like this if there weren't the questions about Christopher Geidt leaving, if there weren't the questions about integrity. So it just comes back to the point that we've got to draw a line under this, and by drawing a line under it, the only way to do that is to fix the thing up, find Lord Geit's replacement, and to make sure that this sort of stuff can't be an issue, so that therefore questions like this are unimportant and never bother anybody.
All right, I'll use your phrase. Let's draw a line under it and talk about poverty, or Gordon Brown warning that rising prices are pushing many more people into poverty. He has a solution, which is to have another budget. He wants Rishi Sunak to come back to the Commons probably by the summer. Let's have a listen to what the former Prime Minister had to say.
I see millions of families in poverty and millions of children going to school ill-clad and hungry, people unable to afford to put up their heating. Now, something has got to be done about this, and it has to be done in a far fairer way than the previous three budgets. That's why I'm pressing. You may have had three budgets, and that may seem enough, but you're going to have a fourth budget. It's absolutely essential, not just to deal with family poverty, but to show a pathway forward to growth, including stable prices.
Well, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, Gordon Brown, but I think we got the thrust of it. John, is he right? Do we need... It's essential, he said, to have a fourth budget. Obviously, Rishi Sunak will come back in the autumn, but one before then.
Well, that was going to be my response, which is Rishi Sunak is going to do a fourth budget. There'll be one in the autumn. And bear in mind as well that some of the things he's already announced haven't yet come in. So, for example, on the 6th of July, the national insurance threshold is about to go up by a very big amount, and the taper rate for universal credit is about to be reduced. Both of those will make a huge amount of difference to the lowest paid in society, making sure they can hang on to more of the money that they've earned.
Miata?
So I don't think he's done enough. I think the intervention that he did a few weeks ago was important because he hadn't acted for so long, so there was a sigh of relief. But if you take the fact that, you know, people on benefits on average will be getting £1,000, that basically just reversed the cut to universal credit that he did last autumn, which was completely foolhardy and short-sighted. It doesn't account for the fact that our social security system has been hacked at for about a decade, which is why it feels so precarious for people. There is no cushion because they were already on the edge. And then you have the absolutely phenomenal price rises that we're seeing when, you know, the government's own economic watchdog is saying biggest squeeze on living standards for 50 years. And it doesn't feel like the Chancellor's acting in step with that. So I think he should be coming back because he's done a little bit, needs to do a lot, particularly for families at the lower end. But, you know, when the average basket's going up by £2,300 in 1 year, I think even the families not on benefits are also really being squeezed. Those in the middle, and that £400 for our energy bills that may or may not filter through to our bills we don't know, is just not enough. And he had the chance to use that windfall tax in quite an expansive way in order to protect families in the middle, and he didn't do that. So I think he's going to be under a fair bit of pressure to come back.
Should he come back sooner than the autumn, Anne?
No, I think, you know, the autumn is fine. I mean, we're already at the end of June or towards the end of June. I don't see why we shouldn't wait for his full budget. What I would say is this, there's a cost of living crisis, and that does mean that everybody's worse off, absolutely everybody. And in these situations, the government has two very clear responsibilities. The first is to protect the very poorest. That it does have a responsibility to. And the second thing it's got to do, and this is where my big argument with the government comes in, is to take the economic measures that will provide the longer-term solution to this, as Mrs. Thatcher did when she came in 79. And it wasn't done overnight. It wasn't done by the middle of Tuesday afternoon. And I think we've got into the habit now of expecting the government to solve things very quickly. And no government, doesn't matter which party it is, which country it is.
12 years isn't quickly, is it?
And I also think we should look at what is happening in the rest of the Western world. We often tease the Americans for being insular. I think Britain's pretty insular. We tend to think these are just our problems. These are global problems.
Well, and it's interesting, you say they're global problems, and there hasn't been enough time, perhaps, to solve some of these structural problems. I could hear Sarah saying, well, we've had a Conservative government of various stripes since 2010, and also some of the latest...
COVID was 2019.
Well, all right, well, let's put that...
These things were not just caused by COVID. It is a complete argument, a complete misrepresentation of what has happened. We have had very low growth. If you compare average growth under the last Labour government and under this 12 years of Conservative government, it is significantly lower under this Conservative government. Now, of course, the Chancellor was right to introduce the measures that he did. He accepted our argument on windfall tax, which was good, although there were some flaws in it. For example, you know, giving
energy support to people with 2 or 3 or 4 homes, which was a waste of money. But we do need, of course, you know, the cost of living crisis is affecting people right now. People, exactly as Marta says, are exactly on the edge. There's no flex. People don't have savings. So if you had an emergency budget, if you could increase benefits in line with inflation, if you could introduce business rates for small businesses, if you could support those businesses that are really high energy intensive, as Labour have suggested, with a £600 million fund, so that you could make sure they can continue operating. If you could cut VAT on energy, you could do some short-term things. Now, in the long term, I agree with Anne. Of course, we need a long-term policy. We haven't had one for 12 years. Where's the industrial strategy? Where's the climate change growth strategy? How are we increasing our renewables? How are we getting the country skilled up?
Let me get John to respond
again.
before I come back to Anne. What's your response to that?
So I think that that Anne is absolutely right to say that you have some short-term requirements, but you've also got to fix the longer-term issues. Otherwise, all you end up doing is treating the symptoms of rising costs of living and of poverty rather than dealing with the underlying causes. And you can't spend your way through that. You've actually got to try and deal with the underlying things that are driving all of this. So, for example, there's a skills and apprenticeship bill which has already been announced, which will make a huge difference to opportunity in this country, to skills and abilities. And as I mentioned before, there's a bill designed to reduce the deadweight cost of government regulations without compromising standards in order to make our
and what about
economy
tax
more
cuts,
nimble.
which a lot of your colleagues are calling for?
And so I already mentioned that we've already got a tax cut which is due on the 6th of July.
And they're talking about going further.
And I would love to be able to go further, but bear in mind as well that you've got to be, as well, the party of sound money. You can't borrow your way to prosperity.
Well, so the problem with tax cuts is that it will always benefit those at the top far more than those at the bottom.
It depends how you do them.
Most tax measures will do that, and it will be disproportionate. And for me, I completely
17 times.
I completely agree with the point about reform. And so, where is the reform of the energy market? It's been broken for a very long time, and it's more broken now because
I was about to add that one. You're absolutely right.
We have consolidation. The government could be putting lots of money into home insulation, a national programme to retrofit our homes. That would have a massive impact now and in the short term. And in the end, that safety net that has been hacked away at, it's got to be restored. Why are we not putting more money? I would want to see 17 billion go into social security that would start to reduce some of the damage. Then you give people that floor, you give people that security, and then you build from that. And then we've got to... we talked about wages at the start of this. We have had stagnating wages for well over 10 years. And at some point, we've got to try and shift that. So those are the big issues. And unfortunately, I hear the government talking about anything but those core issues that it ought to be trying to tackle.
Well, let's talk about potholes. Something rather different. It's a big problem here. It's an even bigger problem in South Africa. I can see, Anne, you're looking forward to this. The government there has allowed the private sector to step in to start repairing them. Let's talk to Pumza Falani, BBC correspondent in Johannesburg. Hello to you. Pumza, how bad is the situation with potholes in South Africa?
Well, there was an address just a few months ago from the Transport Minister here, Mr. Fikile Mbalula, who said that most of the provincial roads in the country have reached their sale-by date. Most of these roads were built to last for about 25 years, and all of them are now have reached a point where they need to be repaired or need to be completely redone. And he says that a big part of this has to do with the fact that the country's road were not built with the number of people that currently live in the country in mind. They weren't built and for the current traffic volumes that we're seeing.
Right.
So, and that's why the private sector in some cities has come in, because they are seeing that some of these potholes are going unrepaired for months, and in rural communities, even years.
Right. So they're bringing in the private sector. Insurance companies are playing a much more major role and also using their repairs as advertising. Tell us about it.
Certainly. So it's become of a twofold thing for insurance companies. There are two companies in Johannesburg, South Africa's economic hub, that are leading this initiative. They've set up an app that makes it possible for the public to report a pothole as they see it, and this will ensure that repair work can happen on it. But they've also seen this, as you say, as an opportunity to advertise. It's not enough for them to fix the potholes, but they also want the public to know who did the repair work, and it, in some ways, get a bigger clientele. So it's also provided a bit of extra coverage for them. But this is something that has been widely accepted by South Africans, because The country's road network at the moment is at around 700,000 kilometers,
Yes.
and most of that is in rural South Africa, places where municipalities are run down and repair work is difficult to come by. So the public have said they appreciate any extra help that can be provided to the state at this stage.
Pumsa Filana there in Johannesburg. Thank you very much. John, is this a good idea, rolling back the state, certainly in terms of local authorities and what they can do, and allowing insurance companies, for example, to step in and advertise?
Well, so there's two competing bits in the Tory soul about this one. Part of me just says, look, this is a great practical short-term answer to fixing holes in the road, and who wouldn't want that to happen?
Absolutely.
So what a great idea. I think in the longer term, it's probably a bit of a wobbly foundation on which to build an essential public service. And economists get very excited about public goods, things we all use, and the way that they should be dealt with, usually by a democratically elected government. So I think it's probably a really good short-term special case answer. I suspect it's probably less robust and sustainable in the longer term.
Sarah, where are you?
I think I agree with John. I mean, in South Africa, they do things differently in lots of different ways. There's a lot more private sector involvement in a lot of things that would be public services, like the fire service in South Africa. So they do things differently. They have much more poverty, a completely different situation. In this country, we have a government that talks about levelling up, but it's hollowed out local government. Local government does not have the money even to fix our roads, and that is shameful. And I would suggest that probably the solution is for government to get a grip and try and focus on the things it should be doing, rather than introducing a scheme like this. Although it does look attractive, as John says, on the outset.
What's to dislike?
What's to dislike?
Well, where
but
are
I think
you?
Perhaps the government has more of a role.
Where are you, Anne, in terms of the Tory soul that John was talking about?
Well, I think it's an excellent short-term solution. Insurance companies obviously have a vested interest because they pay out for damage. And if you live where I live, which is out in the wilds, potholes come and they can sometimes be there a very long time. If you know they're there, it's fine, you go round them. But unsuspecting tourists tend to go in them. So I think it's a lovely short-term solution. I do agree with John. You've got to have a longer-term solution. You can't say, well, we're going to do this forever. But I think most people would welcome a short-term solution. What they want is for the potholes to be mended, not to worry too much about, what the policy is going to be in 10 years' time.
Does it worry you in any way, Miata, in terms of advertising, in terms of perhaps insurance companies picking certain areas to actually fill the potholes in and leaving others aside if it was taken away from local authorities?
Yeah, because in the end there will be a sort of profit motivation behind it, which is the reason why we don't do it. Actually, where there is a lot of consensus is that there are some core essential goods that we all rely on, and actually it makes a lot of sense for us to club together and to pay for that. And what I would say is, obviously, infrastructure and roads is one. I would argue our railways is another. I would argue our public services are another. There are some core things that if we get right as a society, helps us all and helps people to build back from. And what I'd love is for us to have a conversation about what are those things, how do we invest in them in the long term and properly, and all that conversation we're having about tax, you put it in that context. And I feel that's what's missing in our debate at the moment.
Is it a big problem in your constituency, John?
Potholes? Most winters, yes. I mean, just because that's when the frosts come, and so therefore there's a huge, great big bind in spring of trying to fill them in. So I don't think we're unusual. It's part of normal British weather, I think.
Sarah?
Yes. Lots of potholes.
Right. So
I get a lot of incoming emails about potholes, and I'm sure John does.
Well, you may be interested. Sir Rod Stewart, you may remember, recently assembled a crew to fill in the potholes near his Essex estate because they had become so bad. Should we all do our bit, Anne, and become road repairers in our local areas if it becomes that desperate?
Well, I think we all know the problems that are caused by road repairs. And if you have a whole lot of amateurs doing it, you might get exactly the same result. So, yeah, I'm all for being public spirited and cutting back the odd hedge that is obscuring drivers' views and things. But I don't see myself somehow as a road repairer to be relied upon.
All right. Well, just before we go, thank you to all my guests, and the news also from the lobby meeting that Dominic Raab, for that brief time while the Prime Minister was having his operation, did step in to act as Prime Minister. That's all from us today. I will be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15. Have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.